All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. Sorry for the initial delay. We were gathering our thoughts. Today's topic is realism in science fiction and fantasy, and it's a topic that I've seen a lot in, I guess you'd call it the science fiction and fantasy news venues recently, particularly relevant because of recent discussions surrounding certain episodes of Game of Thrones. Anybody heard of that? Possibly.
Is it just all the rapey stuff? I don't actually watch Game of Thrones.
Well,
I don't have HBO.
I've heard it actually brought up in two contexts. One is the rape context, and the other one is the murder context. Because those are really the two big ones, you know. But it's generally I think that we have been for a while in this sort of grimdark phase where everything has to be super dire, and and that's considered to be more realistic. And first of all, I have really huge problems with that characterization. I don't think it's more realistic. First of all, I think these are deliberate authorial choices. But I think that the question of what realism is in a science fiction and fantasy setting and why it's relevant is actually really an important question, right? Because why are we so tied to talking about realism in a context where everything is basically made up? Now, that's kind of a trick question, but I will let you guys noodle on that for a second while I write my notes. And maybe you know already why it's a trick question.
Yeah, I think I know the answer to it, but...
Like, go ahead, lay it on us.
Aren't real.
Well, it's that when you make your one big fantastic or science fictional assumption that sets up the story, then you almost need everything else to be very realistic within that context.
Yep.
Because it makes it more believable. People can accept the one big assumption, but then they kind of have to believe, well, this is how it really would be, how people really would behave, how things really would happen.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And usually, the thing that's been changed is not any kind of element of human nature, right?
Yeah.
The way that people think or the way that people react to things doesn't tend to change. Now, the way that people's culture causes them to react to things, that we can change. We can play with that.
Yeah.
But people do it less often than you might think.
Yeah.
Right? And often they do it less thoroughly than they should. Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
today I was just reading a rant by actually a fan, I guess, of historical romance, but it's equally applicable here, about how many historical romance heroines are really 21st century women.
Oh, yeah, I know. Yeah, people tend to just transplant modern society and how we think in our views into just, costumes. It's like just slap some paint on it and it's good. You're good to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that so I think that you can actually I think that you can't change the way people think in a story. I really don't think you can. What you can change is the conditions around that and how people justify what they do, so that they can appear to think in a different way because of a context that makes sense and supports that. But if that context is missing, people are not going to have a lot of tolerance for, well, I just don't get the way this person is thinking. right?
Well, also the assumptions people are starting from.
Mm-hmm.
If their culture has led them to always see things working a certain way, then very, very few people are just going to are going to, without some outside influence, question or challenge or go against the way their culture works.
Yeah. So basically, I think we've got two things going on here. We want to have a story internal situation where a person is grounded in whatever the culture of the story is, right? And we want that to be done well. But I think that to a certain readership, they're also expecting to find their own views reflected on the page because that's the way they think, right? And you know, actual realism be damned, right? Because I know, you know, some person out there says, I know that there were no such thing as black people in Europe during this period. It's like, well, how do you know that? Did you actually go look it up? Well, no, right? But that person will still object to the perceived problem that they're seeing, right?
Yeah.
Well, this isn't realism. Well, so realism doesn't really mean realism in that context. It really means what I expected.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's the other half of the problem, when what everybody knows isn't actually real, what really was.
So what you have is you have this constructed discourse of history that things, you know, or fictional history even, that people are measuring things against, that sets their expectations. It's a complicated thing, right?
Yeah.
But it's an argument, I think. It's an argument for really doing a good job with your world building. Because if you set up your world building appropriately, then all of the foundational pieces will be in place, and it's not going to be something where people are going to be able to say, I mean, they can still say, well, it doesn't meet my expectations, but they can't say, well, it doesn't fit in the story because see these gaps in the text. People may say, well, it doesn't fit in the story because it just feels like it doesn't fit in the story. But on the other hand, then they won't really textually have much legs to stand on, right?
Yeah.
And what can we do as authors but fall down on what we wrote?
Yeah.
Fall back on what we wrote to say, see, this was what I was trying to do, and it's there, it's in you notice the words in the text. You know, yeah.
There's also the you can't please everyone, but
Absolutely.
Oh God, no.
Well, and the other thing I would remark is, and this is apropos, the other thing that I would remark is that some people take their discourse of expectation, I'm going to call it a discourse of expectation, and anything that doesn't fit within that appears to be marked or to stand out like a sore thumb or to be like a blazing light in the midst of the comfortable discourse of expectation. And it may not be a blazing light in the context of the story as it is being told. It might be a really relatively minor element of the story as it's being told.
yeah.
It's just the
But to
thing
that
stands out to
person
them.
who has this very strong discourse of expectation, it will seem to be the loudest trumpet in the entire orchestra of, you know, all violins. Because it shouldn't be there because, oh my gosh, it doesn't fit my discourse of expectation, and oh my gosh, it must have been put there deliberately to taunt me.
And that's very apropos right now.
Oh, very apropos. You know, it's very interesting how that happens, where somebody decides what things are marked and what things are unmarked / normal, right? And that completely changes, you know, the way that they talk about it, what they expect, and how they portray what they've seen, right?
Yeah.
Discourse, I'm writing my note, of expectation.
Well, going back to the grimdark, it's like somehow everyone's decided that everything was horrible and miserable.
Right, like nobody ever had a good time in the Middle Ages.
Never, ever. No one fell in love. No one was happy. Everyone was raped and starved to death and then stabbed. It was like, there you go, and you were dead by 30, which kind of were, but you know, whatever, right?
Well, okay, so you kind of were, but you kind of weren't. If you weren't dead by 5, you had a chance of making it to the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up, that life expectancy is at birth. If you look at life expectancy at age 5, it's very, very different.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you know, like, but you know, like, for some reason, like because, like, I mean, obviously, grimdark is just a genre. You know, it's like noir mystery versus cozy mystery, or something, you know, in some ways. And I think the people touting it as realistic are incorrect.
Yeah, I think so. I have a question, because I haven't read any what they call grimdark. Like, you know, I haven't officially read anything that was sold to me as grimdark. Has anybody here read any of it?
Not really.
Because I know that there's lots of, you know, there's lots of violence and sexual violence and death and all this kind of stuff. But I wonder, for example, whether people have bad teeth.
I know. You know what? No one ever has, like, bad teeth and body hair.
Body odor of any kind.
I know. Well, I mean,
on the road.
I guess, like, I think, like, okay, there's a really great version of the Borgias on Netflix, and it's just called Borgia. And I like it a lot better than, like, the Showtime one, because, like, I tried watching an episode of the Showtime one, and everyone was pretty, and the costumes were sumptuous and everything.
Yeah.
And the Netflix one is just kind of gross and lived in, and people sweat, and there's dead horses on the street, and the clothes aren't as nice, you know, and stuff's just kind of falling apart, and everyone just, you know, goes on with their day, you know. You know, so I think, you know, if somebody were really gonna do, like, hardcore realism, you would have to be, like, it would have to be everybody would stink. There would be no personal hygiene. People would bathe once a year if you're talking the Middle Ages. You know, it would not look like the Tudors. You know, freaking, you know, what's his face? The
well, I think, so I think there has been. I think there has been a trend to make everything too precious.
Yeah.
Right?
And all the women are thin and beautiful and not starving and have scurvy. And, you know what I mean?
Well, I think, I think disease and a lot of things are underrepresented.
Yeah.
But in a sense, I think that it's appropriate for us not just to make everything ugly and stinky and horrible and everybody's sick and dying and whatever, but to actually try to think through, if you were in that situation, what would you be paying attention to?
Yeah.
Right? Because for us, everybody's stinky and dying and whatever, but for them, it's kind of normal. And this comes back to the marked versus unmarked question.
Yeah.
So I think that it's, in a way, it would be extremely that way, but in a sense, it could afford to be toned down because of the fact that everybody would think it was normal. So to convey that normality to somebody from our world would be a really interesting challenge, let's just say.
Because I think, like, no matter what, you would still notice you'd notice the obvious, at least like the physical traits. You know, you'd notice, you know, so and so was missing a couple teeth in the front,
Mm-hmm.
so that made their speech funny. You know,
But you wouldn't be surprised by it or think it was
no,
unusual. I mean,
no,
yes, it was noticeable, but it wasn't
yeah.
like, oh my gosh, how horrible.
No, but like, you know, like in text, you know, one character looking at another could say like so and so lost another tooth and now there were three gone in the front and he was lisping all the time. You know, like so, you know,
Yeah.
like things like you could still mention at least like sort of the obvious, you know.
Right, right. I
And,
think
you
it's an interesting
know,
question because I mean
yeah.
I look at foreign and I think, okay, what about people's teeth? I do think about this stuff, and I go, well, they're a pretty advanced society. They've just put fluoride in the water.
Yeah, there you go. Well, you know, I heard, well, okay, it was a documentary. Oh my God, everything I know comes from TV. And it was like on sort of like the Middle Ages, before the discovery of America. And everybody, they said, had actually fairly okay teeth because there was no sugar. The
Yeah.
instant sugar was imported, everyone's teeth just rotted out.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so, you know, like, oh, and there was another one of like Egyptians. The upper classes actually had worse teeth than the lower classes because they could afford finer ground flour that had a lot more stone dust in it. Or something, yeah, because
Oh, interesting.
no, it would actually, like, their fine fancy bread wore their teeth out quick. So
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, you can't like don't like quote me on that or something, you know, but that's what I remember from like that documentary. So
Well, it's an interesting concept, and also, you know, that the wealthy could afford more whatever sweetener was available, honey. Or,
oh
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm. Well, and it does come back to setting up a justification for things, right? You just don't have stuff happen. You know, you give people reasons why it's that way, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. And I think that if you think about it scientifically, I think that different subgenres call for realism in different scientific arenas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or social.
Yeah, because you're always having to choose which things to mention and which things not to mention.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think science fiction, and this is like why I don't write it, requires I sort of think like a lot more research and like, you know, you have to know your science because there are actual scientists writing science fiction. So if you don't know what you're doing, people are just kind of going to make fun of you and you know, not publish you because your science is weak.
Well, okay, so yes and no.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Right.
because you know, I've got a lot of background in linguistics and anthropology, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those are sciences that are actually highly regarded in hard science fiction circles. I do not have any more than a high school background in physics or chemistry. But when I'm working with people like the people at Analog and I've screwed something up with my physics, they'll say, hey, you got to fix this because physics. And I'll be like,
okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, so it's a matter of focus, right?
Yeah. Or I think it's also, in a weird way, a matter of can what you've made up, like, can you, like, justify it enough even without science? And I'm gonna say, and I know they've actually come up with the science after the fact, But like Star Trek warp engines, right?
So you have things that are basically hand wavium that then people go, well, we have to be scientific, so we have to kind of backform, you know, this stuff. But I think it's still a focus question, because if you think about, like, so for example, my stories are all set on alien, you know, my analog stories, other than Mindlocker, are all set on alien planets where humans have traveled there faster than light, and they're dealing with the culture of the aliens that they encounter there. Okay?
Yeah.
I don't discuss faster than light travel and how it's
yeah.
Because it's irrelevant. We're already there. No big deal. You know.
Yeah.
I did a lot of research on terraforming when I wrote At Cross Purposes, because I knew that my main character was going to be an engineer, and that she was a terraforming engineer, and so she was going to have to be able to talk about terraforming in a way that was at least be plausible. That there was actual science behind it. So yeah, I did some research there. But on the other hand, I didn't go, I mean, like, you don't have to research everything.
Yeah.
You have to research whatever science your story hangs on. And I think that's what makes hard science fiction, and I think that's the way, at least in the past, that has been the way that Analog described what they were looking for, which is stories where if you take the science out of the story, the story falls apart, because it relies on the science to get the story done, right? So whatever that piece is that you're relying on to get the story done cannot fall apart because, well, you don't understand physics well enough.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? But if it's not about physics, then you have leeway to have that strength in other areas of science. Right?
Well, yeah, and that's also kind of what I was getting at about, you get the one big assumption that, so, okay, faster than light travel works, and there are alien planets with cultures on them that we can interact with.
Yeah.
That's just in the background. You don't have to talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And
that's your big contrary to fact assumption.
Right.
And then within that context, then you need a fair amount of realism.
Yep. Yep. And whatever you are focusing on, so if you are focusing on, like, your main character is a chemist, knowing some chemistry is really recommended.
Yeah.
Knowing, but see, like, so when I talk about a person who is a scientist that I'm wanting to portray in a story, and how to make that person feel real, it's not that I have to understand their science, but I have to understand enough of it, and I also have to understand how that person would talk about their science. So from a linguist's point of view, or from a discourse analyst's point of view, a lot of what you're doing when you're writing a story is you're portraying people with language. So what you really need to be focusing on, even more than what they know, is how they talk about what they know.
Or what they think about what they know.
Right.
And what kinds of things they would actually do.
Yep. That's a good one too.
Very few chemists spend their day in the classic TV laboratory with all the beakers of bright-colored fluid and the elaborate glassware apparatus.
I have no idea what chemists do in real life.
Yeah. I mean, even if they do spend their day in the laboratory, it doesn't look like that.
Not anymore. I wonder if there was a point where it did look like that, and that's just kind of where it stuck.
Yeah, well, maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
I don't know. Like, I don't. I don't know what chemists do all day.
Well,
my college roommate was a chemistry major, but that was a very long time ago.
Oh, I was gonna say it's probably a lot of stuff on computers now. You're like computer modeling molecules or something. I don't know.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting. So okay, so now we've talked about science in terms of like, you want to have your physics correct and your chemistry correct, and okay, fine. I think psychology is something you really want to get right.
Yeah.
And culture. And culture and the thing that I think a lot of times when people don't think about culture, they tend to do it better. Because it's the sort of the reality that you live.
Yeah.
And if you can get in the right space to represent the reality that you live, then you'll have your culture and you'll have done it well. But the contrast with that, now, of course, there are people who don't think about it and who just totally can't even get in the headspace and oops.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, they write
19 like, I'm going to do culture now, and they start sticking stuff in the story. Right? But it's more like, I have this collection of artifacts, and I'm going to stick it in the story. But not looking at the interconnections of the system.
Yeah.
And the way that would influence judgment. Yeah.
So does anyone here watch Game of Thrones? Do we know anything about it collectively?
I don't think we do.
From what the internet tells us.
I have read, considering the fact that I haven't actually watched it,
yeah,
I've read a ridiculous amount of meta text about it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, seriously.
And I'm
like
also
all anyone talks about nowadays.
I'm also friends with David Peterson, who was the inventor of Dothraki. So I've been hearing a lot about it over the years. I mean, I don't talk to him all the time, but I hear about it.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think, because of him and because of various things, I have quite a strong interest in it. So I read lots of articles about it, but I haven't actually watched because I don't get HBO.
I know, yeah, same here. I know,
yeah, so
no HBO, and I'm not going to invest in reading that many books at this point.
Yeah. So.
Although I did burn through like 7 Temeraire books in like a month and a half, so.
Yeah.
Wow.
But those are good.
Yes. Big fan of Temeraire.
Yeah. Well,
okay, but this isn't about Game of Thrones per se. I mean, I think that I found it to be the inciting event of this topic because of these articles that we've read that talk about how, well, the justification for all this rape and violence is generally realism, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the real is beyond capture by text.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It can be evoked by text. But in a way, we're all dealing with this discourse of expectation, but everybody has a slightly different discourse of expectation.
Yeah.
But I think that, so denying authorial choice is not the right way to go about it, right?
Yeah, no, those books are like that because he wrote them like that. And same with, like with everyone else, everybody who's writing is right, you make your own choices when you're writing.
Right. Now, I think that there are a lot of defaults, and I think that, and actually this links back to what we were talking about with science and science fiction. There are a lot of, to put it in Glenda's words, it's actually not one big assumption. It's a whole set of big assumptions that kind of come in as a set, as a schema, and then within that, because we're thinking within that framework, we then create the changes that we want. And then the question becomes, as an author, how far down do you dig into those big assumptions?
Yeah.
To look for things that would plausibly be changeable.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, like, I can't really think of an example, but I'm sure I've probably read it where, you know, where like the author changes one thing and nothing else. Okay, you know what? I'm gonna do it. Okay, Harry Potter. Okay.
Okay.
And I know I am going to blaspheme. Okay.
Lay it on us. Lay it on us. Make your argument.
Okay. Basically, it's like you change, like, it's got the real world, right? The Muggle world, and then you've got the Wizarding world, and somehow, like, never the twain shall meet, right? Wizards are vastly ignorant about all things, just, you know, regular Muggle people know and do, and yet exist within sort of the culture, like, but damn it, I wish I could brain today. It's just not plausible, because it's like you change that one thing and nothing else in the rest of the world changes, okay? And yet you've got this whole freaking world of dragons and wizards and unicorns and phoenixes, and nothing else is different. Nothing. And it annoys the crap out of me. Just... Oh.
Yeah.
Well,
with modern technology and airplanes and satellites, how all this stuff could be kept hidden.
Yeah, and on top of that, the wizards are assholes. Okay? Because they have completely... Okay, they're all living cancer-free. What is it? Dumbledore's 150, right? Okay, they're withholding medicine. They're withholding environmental solutions. They're withholding all of this from the rest of the world, and they're letting us tank the planet and die of cancer.
That's a fair point.
Well, so it is an interesting argument. Okay.
Yeah.
I see your point. And I think that it's not the first time that a secret world has been done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, Rick Riordan's books, the Percy Jackson books, they rely on a concept called mist. That deliberately obscures the senses of the non non-Greek deity sort of world to say, well, everybody's going to interpret this as something different, right? And you don't have mist in the case of the Harry Potter world, and in other places too.
Yeah. But the fact that you had so much interaction, that so many Muggles came into the Wizarding world as wizards and bring their culture with them to the Wizarding world, and then there's wizards who marry Muggles, and then, but it's like there's no cross-pollination whatsoever.
And I hear you on that, but you know what I think also? I think there's something else going on here, which is that there are secret worlds in our world. And there are places where these borderlines are not being acknowledged, and there are places where cross-pollination is not happening. Right? I mean, because part of the whole modern discussion about privilege and lack thereof is that people who are in a position of power can completely ignore the existence of people who don't have it. And they can even ignore their very existence sometimes. And when forced to acknowledge their existence, well, okay, they don't count, or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, while I see your point, and while I think to myself, you know, maybe there was something missing where people would see these people more often and just not notice them, or think they were homeless, or think, you know, like, or think there was a circus in town, or whatever. That wasn't the focus of what Harry Potter was doing, which is fine.
No.
But if you did want to say, okay, let's take a look at a secret world and how that would interact with our world, I think that people are really actually quite good at being blind to stuff.
Yeah.
And certainly when there's a population that keeps mostly to itself and you know, does its own thing, I'm not convinced that if the wizarding world offered cancer cures and environmental solutions to the Muggle world that they would even be believed for a second, and they would probably be laughed out of town.
I don't know, because we're going under the assumption that, okay, in the Harry Potter world, there's always been magic. And we're going from the assumption of a world that has no magic here and now, and assuming, I mean, because, like, you have to look at, like, it's almost like once you change something on this Earth, you've changed everything. So in a world, and we can't, you know, in a world where there's always been magic, because there's always been magic in Harry Potter universe, but we're assuming from our perspective that we would all laugh off magic because we don't have it here. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So.
No, and I hear you, and I think that I think it's not a bad argument, but I think there are reasons why I'm just ready to let that go and enjoy the story.
Yeah, true.
But I also think that not very many people have actually engaged with the history of magic in a world with magic. And actually, Rowling does a pretty good job dealing with the history of magic within the wizarding world in her world, but just not the history of how magic has, and if magic has been perceived by what's the non-magical world kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I mean, so maybe what we're looking at is different ways, different parameters along which to define realism, right?
Yeah.
You know, oh, well, this is a world where everybody's really, really horrible to each other. So lots of terrible violence has to happen.
Yeah. I mean, well, maybe under that, then it's all fine. It's like,
well,
whatever. Like, then it's all real. It's all real. It's all real.
It's about choice, though.
Yeah.
It's about choice of parameters.
Yeah.
And it's about, I mean, and so if you're looking at well, so because I don't think so, because once you start pushing a little bit on that grimdark thing, what you discover is that there are lots and lots and lots of sexist assumptions underlying a lot of it.
Oh yeah.
I'm not going to say all of it. I don't know all of it.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, it's a very sort of based on a lot of assumptions that don't take certain kinds of mindsets into account.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff. I mean, I don't want to comment on grimdark more than I have, because I really don't know it nearly as well as I should.
We all need to go read
However, there are a lot of books where, you know, people say, well, we are in a bad situation where women are oppressed, and because they've made that choice,
Mm-hmm.
they then, without thinking, make a whole bunch of further choices that basically mean that the women are stupid. They don't know what social tools they possess. They're completely helpless and incapable of doing a thing, which is generally not what happens. When people are oppressed, they know exactly the tools that are available to them, and they know how to use those particular tools to the hilt because it's the only thing they have to protect themselves with,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And it's so that is a form of realism too, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, if any kind of system that creates characters as non-people who wouldn't have self-interest and wouldn't think things through in their own way, you know what I mean? It has problems, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know.
I'd like to go back to Morgan's question a little bit. I
Sure.
think there's a question of how much.
Okay, so let's go back to Morgan's question, which was, the rape in Game of Thrones is excused by some as realism. If it had been absent, would that absence have been noted and decried as unrealistic? Is that the question you were talking about, Linda?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, I don't
So
think
you can have zero rape and violence.
Mm-hmm.
You can have constant rape and violence, or you can have occasional rape and violence.
Mm-hmm.
And like specific, like if you want to talk medieval, I'm sure rape and violence occurred. It happened. But do you want to focus exclusively on it? Or do you just want to have, yes, it happened, a couple of instances, but it's not what the story's about.
Right. 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 And also, you know, if we're going to get into, okay, well, this is a world where we're going to deal with rape and violence because they occurred, let's take a look at how they occurred and when they occurred and why they occurred and what the systems were that encouraged that and what the systems were that were supposed to work against it and why they weren't working against it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It seems to have, like, there's just, like, I don't know, like, from what very little I know about medieval warfare, wasn't it mostly like you kind of had to do stuff during certain seasons?
Yeah.
Because at a certain point, everyone would just go home and like bring in the harvest. Like all your little, you know, serfdom soldiers would have to go home and harvest the wheat.
Yeah.
And so you were sort of operating under these deadlines because there were other things that had to happen. Like you couldn't just have continuous war all the time. It was off and on because people had to go do other things.
Yep.
Yeah, you couldn't do it in the winter because of weather. You couldn't do it in the spring because of planting season. You couldn't do it in the fall because of harvest.
Fighting with torches is really tough.
Yeah. So like you sort of had these like limited amounts of time, you know. You know, if you were really far north, you know, you had to do something before the sea ice came in. You know, or you couldn't get your ships out of the bay anymore. You know, so it's, you know, so like I'm not sure, like maybe like a world that's just constant war. You can't do that because who's growing food?
Yeah.
You know, like you know, I sort of like, okay, my personal sort of benchmark for a realistic world has always sort of been is like, could you live there and raise kids? Like I don't even like, and then also, does it have like what seems like a plausible past? And could you imagine it in 100 years and they like invent cars or something? You know, maybe not that, but it's like,
Yeah.
could things actually change? You know, is there a past? Is there a present? Is there a future? And could you like have a job and raise kids there? Like, is it plausible? Could
Right.
you live there and raise kids?
Like, is
And
there
if
an economy, and are there ways to create a certain generation of
government and a
people
police
there?
force, and
Yeah.
you know, is there something? You know, is it nothing but like just roving bands of armies killing people and peasantry? You know, or can you actually live there? And so I always sort of think like if the answer is yes, then you've set out a pretty decent, realistic world
Yeah.
because people have to be able to live in it somehow, you know? I mean,
Right. And I think also one of the ways that I think about this is in a way that as you're basically in a bubble, and the bubble is where your protagonist is and all the things that are surrounding them at that time. And the bubble kind of travels through the story, right?
Yeah.
But the question in my mind is always, well, do I have a sense that outside that bubble things exist? That when the story turns right, if I turned left, would I find something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? And I think if you don't have that, then that is a really big problem. I mean, I hate to say this, but we're being blasphemous today. Sword of Shannara.
Okay.
It was the book. Everybody was like, I mean, I read it a long time ago, but I remember everybody telling me, oh, it's a great book, got to read this book, right? And I remember reading it, and I remember that was the first time I had ever had this feeling where, like, I was in a bubble, and I was traveling along through the story, and I really felt like if I strayed off the path, there was nothing there.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't read it in years. I couldn't tell you what gave me that impression, right?
Yeah.
But I really didn't feel like I understood that there was a world around and that things had interconnected. You know, I mean, yeah.
I have the same thing with like most of the D&D books.
Mm.
You know, it's just they're there, they exist so that the characters can run around this fantasy world and slay dragons and meet the same 5 races that exist in D&D, and in the end, it's like there's no past, there's no present, there's no future. You couldn't live there. There's nobody in D&D doing anything other than like D&D job stuff. You know, you know what I mean? So like I kind of feel it with like the Dragonlance novels and some of the others. Kind of feel like that to me. Like there's not really like
Well, you know, I mean, I think that they're resting on a foundation of trust and assumptions. And if you start questioning those, then you discover they're not as well supported as you'd like, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, I totally get it. And so I'm going to tell you something about the story that I'm currently writing, because it's a story where stuff is happening, and it's kind of you know, Varen's a funny place because there's stuff that goes on that people perceive as being supernatural because they can't explain it, right? But the idea is that actually there are things that can't explain it. It's just the people involved can't. You know, they don't know how to explain it, and so they're struggling with it. But what it ends up looking like sometimes on the surface is that it's a science fiction world with fantasy stuff happening in it, right? And some people will say, oh, well, it's clearly all science fiction, and some people will say, well, it's clearly science fantasy or whatever, you know. But my commitment to realism is about people's lives and their interpretations of events and their judgment, right? And so what I found was that I'm having this, you know, I'm writing this story where strange things are occurring and people are seeing other people light on fire for no reason, and like, stuff is happening, and then like they're, you know, the event is over and they're getting back in the car, you know, to go back home because they don't have any other option. They still have to go back to their lives. And two of the characters end up talking about, well, how does this affect my employment status? Which is why I thought about you, Tay, just now. I was like, well, she's going to find this story interesting because it's like, so now that I've lit on fire, you know, and I've been called weird names by so-and-so, are you comfortable still employing them?
If your world has accountants, you've won. If it has plumbers, you've won. You know, because it's like all those sort of crap unsung jobs that keep actual freaking civilization from breaking down. Are really like the most important. You know, and I have a real annoyance with things that disregard those as unimportant.
Yeah.
You know. So like, yeah, if something weird and horrible happened and you're worried about your job, that is completely legit.
Yeah, well, it was funny because I actually, you know how when you're writing you can be surprised by stuff that happens, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, wait, they're talking about employment? Okay, all right then. Of course they're talking about employment. Yeah, that makes complete sense.
It does.
It does.
It totally does. Yeah.
Yeah. And Morgan, you've made an interesting point about how in a game everything is, like, every last detail is expected to be relevant in some way. Well, that's not actually entirely true with the large-scale games. But yeah, there should be a way to interact with everything in a game, because you never know what gamers are going to do when there are thousands of them. So they could be able to interact with the game world in all kinds of ways, right? In novels, there's a lot more room for scenery. There's a lot more room for extra detail. And actually, there's a role for extra detail. There, you know, especially when you're dealing with mysteries and clues and that kind of thing. You don't want your clue to be the only thing in the room. You have to have a much larger view of what's happening there. Otherwise, it seems like, why are there only 5 things in this room?
Yeah.
5 things in the room is more common when you're dealing with video games, actually. Or with D&D sometimes. Anyway, so it's 4 o'clock. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And you guys are awesome, and I think I'm happy with the things we talked about, so thank you. I'm sorry we got a late start.
Okay.
Next week we're going to do this on Thursday again.
Okay.
And I don't yet have a topic. Okay. I'm not ready to resume today's intended topic yet. So I don't know.
I kind of want to do that article you posted about, like, the wife bonus and, like, those really, really rich people. Like, okay, it's sort of like, it's not quite like that as a topic, but, like, the idea, like, the sort of social stratification and how it changes what people do and what they think about. Like,
okay.
Like,
I think
like what the expectation for the rich, the expectation for the middle class, and the expectation for the poor, and the way it shifts as you go up and down, if that makes sense.
Yep. I'm ready for that.
And a completely different topic spawning off that same article is marriage. What does marriage mean in your culture?
Yeah, good one.
How does it work?
Oh my god, I completely ignore it because I write like middle grade. Sometimes YA.
And I'm gonna come up with one out of the blue, and I'm going to say gardens and plants.
Interesting.
I thought of it because I looked out at my garden, which I am currently redoing.
Yeah.
Great. So that gives us some things to anticipate in the next few weeks. let's try, let's say tentatively social stratification for next week, which would be fun. And you guys are awesome, and thank you, and we will see you next Thursday at 3. All right?
Okay.
Yay.
Bye.